for so long, you've had dads and who have not been involved because of societal norms that have been placed on them. And then, or also kind of like stay out of here, this is woman's work, kind of broad generalization. And so now we're, as a society, trying to shift and say we want everybody involved across the board, but you don't provide the resources for these dads who want to get involved to get involved. So I decided to make a podcast, which is the Dtalks podcast, which I'm the host of.
That's Joe Shaw. Joe is a dad of two living in Texas and is a host of his own show about parenting called Dtalks Podcast. I really enjoyed having Joe on the show because he brought some really interesting perspectives and topics up that I think you're going to love. He shares about how he's always wanted to be a dad, even having names picked out for his future kids when he was in high school. With all that enthusiasm, Joe looked for parenting resources to help him prepare for baby number one, but found that almost everything was geared towards moms or played into that bumbling idiot dad trope. So he started his own show to tackle the issues dads were coming to him with. We talk about a few of those issues in today's episode, like how to effectively communicate with your partner, Joe's unique concern about social media, and his favorite piece of advice to give to new dads. Welcome to the This Is Parenting podcast, a show devoted to sharing the roller coaster journey of parenthood from moms and dads all over the world. I'm your host, Andrea Rhodes. Information and show notes about today's episode can be found at thisisparentingpodcast.com. Let's get started.
Sure. So I live and work in Texas. And so I've got two children, a 4-year-old and a 1.5-year-old, a daughter and a son, and they're just absolutely fantastic. So my parenting journey kind of started, a couple of years ago, and it was interesting to me that it was something where I was super enthusiastic about. It was something like, I think a lot of dads talk about, like, they don't think about having kids or they don't think about this or that. But man, I was like a teenager thinking about names for my kids. I've been super enthused about being a dad for a long time. And when I finally got the opportunity, I was ready to dive in, and I found that while there was a lot of fantastic resources for moms and parents in general, there was a surprisingly a lackluster amount of resources for dads. A lot of the resources I found were very tied to the idea of like, well, your one job as a dad is to not screw up, right? And it's like, okay, I don't quite know what it is. It was under the assumption that dads are bumbling idiots most of the time, and it felt very frustrating for me. And so I kind of pushed through that roadblock and went, whatever, I'm just going to consume everything I can and just make it work. And it worked. But I found that when my daughter was about 1.5, I had coworkers that were coming up to me and having similar frustrations about, they wanted to be involved dads, but they didn't know where to start. And the only reason they came up to me was because they knew I had a kid. And so they said, what resources are there? And I said, well, there's not really any. And I found two instances that would happen when I had coworkers do this. One is they would do like I did, and they would say, whatever, I'm just going to make the best of it and push through and make it work. Or they would have another situation where they would say, you know what, then I think this is a sign I need to just defer to my wife or my partner and do whatever they say. And that's also frustrating because you have, for so long, you've had dads and who have not been involved because of societal norms that have been placed on them. And then, or also kind of like stay out of here, this is woman's work, kind of broad generalization. And so now we're, as a society, trying to shift and say we want everybody involved across the board, but you don't provide the resources for these dads who want to get involved to get involved. So I decided to make a podcast, which is the Dtalks podcast, which I'm the host of. And the D stands for dad, so it's Dtalks. And it was created as a resource for dads to kind of get an idea of what they can expect from parenting, and then also have a community where they hear other dads and other parents alike share their various individual parenting journeys and what triumphs they've had, what struggles they've had to overcome and work through. And just on a more broad level, it's just knowing that you're not alone and you're part of a larger collective of parents. And, I know one of the things you talk about on the show is that, we're all just trying to raise happy and healthy kids. And so at the end of the day, that's what we want to do. And for dads to feel like they're a part of something was huge for me. And it's kind of evolved from there, but that's kind of my shtick and what I'm all about.
I love that. And we're going to talk more about your podcast because I really love your show as well. But first, I want to dive in a little bit. When you say that your coworkers were coming up to you and they wanted to kind of grab you and seek some advice on how to get more involved, what does get more involved mean? What did that mean in
Sure.
your circle of friends and other dads?
Sure. It's a good question. So I think one of the most common questions was, what can I expect in the pregnancy phase? Like, what is normal? How can I be a help, not a hindrance? When do I need to be a problem solver? When do I need to just listen? When do I need to, go to the appointments? When is it okay to, maybe not go if there is such a thing? Just kind of general advice on that. And then pivoting, it was a lot of, what is normal? What is normal for my kid to have? What is normal? And the thing I kept saying is, look, normal's a lot of things, right? So I think you got to find that, children aren't as breakable as we may think they are at first. And so you need to really understand that you don't need to rush into the ER for every single thing. You need to really have a good pediatrician that you trust. You need to know when you can kind of like wait and see as opposed to giving medication or taking them in. And you need to also understand that you're not going to know the answers. I think a lot of dads thought that like you've had a kid, so you must have the answer book. And if you can pass that book on, that'd be great. And it's like, no, there's not a book. You find out very quickly that there's not a book, and you've just got to kind of wing it and trial and error. This works, that didn't work. Why did this work? This works because my kid responds well to this because of whatever reason. And sometimes there is no reason, and you just got to kind of move forward. And so it was a lot of reassuring my coworkers that this is normal. It's normal to feel overwhelmed. It's normal to not know the answers, and it's okay. And you're going to fail, but you're also going to succeed because you're going to work through those failures and learn from them and then not make the same mistake twice.
So it sounds like it kind of came in two buckets, where one was more on the education side,
Right.
actual information about child rearing.
Right.
Then there seemed to be this other bucket that I would love to talk about more. And that seems to be how to successfully partner with your wife or your baby mama, how to
Right.
actually navigate that relationship. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is accurate.
So I would love to talk a little bit more about the latter in terms of how you approach that and the types of advice or conversation you had around navigating that trickiness with this new phase in your relationship with your partner, and how to make the most of it and get what you want out of it, because it sounds like these dads were coming to you because they wanted something. They wanted to be a part of it more than they felt maybe they were at the time. So how
Right.
did you navigate that, and how did you share your expertise with them, and what were you telling them?
Sure. So I think the number one thing that I told them was the number one lesson that I learned, which is my wife didn't know any more than I did. I just kind of assumed, based on everything I had seen in society or been told, that she would instantly know. It's like the baby comes out and she instantly has 50% more knowledge than I do, whereas that's not the case.
Not at
And so right. And so there was a lot of me, deferring to her on basic stuff where sometimes I might have a better idea or just be better at it, whether like I was really good at swaddling, right? And that was my go-to. But I wouldn't always jump in and do it because I just kind of thought like, well, I'm not supposed to. And nobody said that. It was just baked into me from a young age that this is the way the world is, but we're trying to change that. And so once I got it, and I'd say I got it probably a little bit later than I would have liked, but once I got the fact that, look, we're both going through this equally at the same time, and we are learning on the fly, we're sharing what works, and we're pointing out when somebody is better at something else so the other one can pick up the slack in a different area. And it's really learning the way in which you and your partner work best together, and then knowing each other's strengths and being able to lean in and lean out as needed. And so that was the number one piece of advice, was to say, look, your partner is not going to know any more than you do unless they're coming in with a kid, which the people I was talking to didn't. It was their first kid. And so I said, you're both equally coming into this with no knowledge, and you need to not assume she's going to know more. And you need to ask a lot of questions and work and say, do you think this works? Do you think that works? And it's really more of a conversation between the two of you to figure out how you both work best together, how you parent together, and then who the child is responding to during what activity, and learning those cues together and sharing that information and communicating effectively so you can both succeed. So it was really about communicating effectively and, going in not assuming that you're 10 steps behind because you didn't have the baby.
Okay, so listen up, moms that are listening, because I couldn't agree more about this communication piece. And the thing that really stuck out for me, and with my experience with my two kids and my husband, is I wish we would have literally been face to face and told each other that neither of us know what we're doing. It
Right.
would have taken so much pressure off of myself. So I love bringing your perspective into this conversation, because on your side of things, you're wanting to get more involved and don't know how. For me as a mom, and only in my experience anyway, I felt so much pressure to know it all. And it would have been such a relief and such a burden lifted from me had my husband and I kind of looked at each other and had that moment of like, we don't know what the hell is going on.
Right.
And we're both in the same boat trying to figure it out. And the pressure would have just been alleviated. But instead, I felt like if he didn't know what he was doing and I didn't know what I was doing, I had to at least pretend that I knew what I was doing.
Right. Because that was baked in. Yeah.
Yeah, so that somebody was at least taking the ball and running with it,
Right.
so that would have taken off so much pressure, and in hindsight that would have been very helpful.
Right. It took a lot longer than I would have liked it to, but eventually we got there. And that's what I keep telling people from day one is like, number one, neither one of you knows what you're doing. So don't act like one of the other knows, because you don't, and just tell each other that and just be like, I don't know what's working. Can you help me? Just
Yeah.
keep that line of communication open, because that is what's going to keep getting you through the next phase and allowing you to eventually come out on top.
Another question I have, I also feel that some moms can feel defensive if the
Mm.
dad or their partner says, hey, I think I might be better at this. Like, I might be better at swaddling than you are. Can I take this responsibility on? How did you approach that with your wife when you started communicating the things that you were probably better at to her?
Sure. So I think number one, I have to give my wife a lot of credit with that, with regards to she was very observant and spoke up herself and said, hey, I think, well, she didn't say you're better at this in that way. She said, I've noticed you're very good at how you're swaddling, and I really could use some tips. Can you show me how you do it and really kind of maybe give me some pointers on things I may not be doing as well? And so she really took the ball on that. So I got to give her full credit. But then what that taught me was, I would be doing something and I would be frustrated. And then, I can't quite remember exactly what it is. It might've been, I'm trying to think. Oh, my son had a tongue tie when he was born that we had to get lasered. And so we were having to do tongue exercises with him. And, you had to like stick your finger in his tongue and like allow him to like move the tongue around. So that way you're really stretching the muscles, kind of a thing. And, I wasn't as good at it at first, and I wasn't quite figuring it out. And because we had already had that communication, instead of just trying to make it work or getting defensive, I spoke up and said, you seem to be having a greater effectiveness with the exercises. Can you show me how you're approaching it so that way I can get better at it? And she said, absolutely, of course, I'm super helpful. And I think the way in which we communicate is crucial, not just communicating, but the way in which we communicate. And for me, the way I've found that I effectively communicate is I don't approach, like when I'm talking, I don't say, I'm better at this than you, or I think I know better, or whatever. I always approach it with like, hey, I've noticed that, this seems to be a little bit smoother for me. And I'm not great in this other area. Can you help me with that? And maybe we can share some tips and some tricks, and we can do a lot of information sharing. And so I approach it from the perspective of, hey, we're in this together. Let's be a community, as opposed to let me be the teacher and you be the student, and vice versa. And I think when you have a kind of a group think dynamic, it fosters this real positive energy culture, as opposed to, a back and forth where it's super easy, especially when you've had no sleep and, maybe hormones might be raging, or you might not have any coffee, or whatever the case may be. There's a lot of different factors in play, and it's super easy to get defensive when you approach it from like a I versus you perspective, as opposed to we come together and collaborate on this.
Yeah, so what you're saying is don't be a dick about it.
Yes, that is the short form, the short answer. Yeah. Too long, didn't listen. Don't be a dick.
That's right. Perfect. So,
Right.
so tell me a little bit more now that you've been a dad. You said your oldest was 4.5.
Yes, that's correct.
So you've been a dad for 4.5 years now. What do you think has gotten a little bit easier over time and even easier with your second child?
It's funny,
If
easier.
anything.
I think what has gotten easier, I guess what I would say is my expectations have gotten easier. Well, no, how do I want to frame this? So I think what has enabled me to feel that things have gotten a lot easier is my approach to the day-to-day life has shifted. And so I think the way in which I can explain that is, for a little bit after my daughter was born, I still expected to have the exact same routine I've had my entire working life. And, get up at 5 a.m., exercise, get ready, shower, go to work, yada, 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 all this stuff. And I was like, I don't understand why I was so surprised, but I was really surprised and caught off guard that, like, I would get up and then my daughter would get up and I would have to tend to her. And then I didn't have time to work out, or I didn't have time to shower, or I didn't have whatever the case may be. And I was really stunned and I was really feeling behind all the time. And while that feeling didn't go away, eventually after my son was born, and I'm at a point now where I've realized, like, I'm not going to get to everything that I need to get to today. And so I really approach it from we my wife and I have this philosophy of, like, if you're cleaning the house and people are coming over, and you go, what is the number one thing that if somebody walked in I'd be mortified that they saw? And then you work your way back from there, most important to least important. And so I structure my days on what is the absolute, like, if the day ended I would be very upset that this didn't happen. And of course got to go to work every day, but it's like, within work, what is that? And then within life, what is that? And then I recognize that everything is subject to change, but my expectations are not tied to I'm going to get everything done. It's, I want to get 5 different things done. I'm probably going to get 2 of them done, but that's okay. And that's allowed me to focus on the fact that my daughter is able to do so much for herself, and she's so excited to tell me about her days at school. And my son's, developing and talking and walking, and he's showing me all the things that he finds fascinating. And it's allowing me to shift my perspective on, I've got to get everything done, to I'm going to get a couple things done, and now I'm going to pivot and just spend time with my kids and fully soak them in before bedtime. And then I'm going to pivot to the next thing. And it's that kind of pivoting throughout the day that's allowed me to just relax and take things a little bit easier and a little bit more in stride, which is in turn allowed my mental health and my, like, physical health to be significantly better as a result.
I think that's a really good approach. A few of the moms that I've had on this podcast, we've had a similar chat in terms of that overwhelming feeling that you're not getting enough done and that there's not enough hours in the day. Do
Right.
you also feel like that's going to be never ending? And we talked about how in the moment, especially in the beginning, the first couple of years, your life changes so drastically, and to your point, the schedule all of a sudden changes. The things that you used to be able to do, you can no longer do, and a lot of drops off of your personal plate. And at the time, it feels so final. It feels like, okay, this is what it's like to be a parent. This is what it's going to be like forever, and I am never going to get back to the life that I used to have. Is that something that you felt as well, or is that kind of a mom thing?
No, definitely felt it 100%. And I think, I think I would still feel that if I didn't understand that you have to create a new normal. And so the number one, like, one of the other things, I was actually speaking to a friend of mine the other day, and we were chatting about this, and we were talking about the fact that when we first became dads, we did have that overwhelming sense of, I've lost my structure, my routine, my sense of self, and now it's being dictated by this tiny human that's screaming and crying and all this kind of different stuff. And it almost feels, and this is going to sound a little controversial, but it almost feels a little unfair in that aspect of, like, I've had my life for this X amount of years and now, like, I don't have it anymore. And but then you have to realize that it's like, yeah, but your whole life has been made up of new normals. You just have not been made forcefully aware of it until this moment. And so when you step back and realize, like, oh, well, that normal I had was only for like 3 years, because before that I was here and doing this, and before that and so you have to realize that life is ever shifting and life is ever evolving. And then once you realize that this is just the latest chapter in your evolving normal, then you're now set up for success to where you can look at how you want to structure this new normal. And for a couple of years, it's not going to be structured by anything you want to do. You just got to figure out how you can survive in the new normal. But then you get to a point where your kids are a little bit more routine oriented, a little bit more scheduled, and then your schedule kind of slows down and you're able to say, okay, my new normal is this is how I'm going to structure my day. Kids are picked up here, may clean the house, may not. Dinner's on the table, bedtime, like all this stuff. And then you start realizing that this new normal, you're going to get used to it, and then something else is going to change. And so I think if you realize that your normal is evolving, you're allowing the sense of overwhelming to go away and dissipate. And then you're setting yourself up for success when you've got to pivot to a new normal in a couple of years when your kids are going to school.
Yep, I agree with that 100%. And I wish I would have had the understanding of how fleeting each of those stages really are, because again, it would have taken so much pressure off of myself and would have improved my mental health quite a bit during the first few years. And especially when your kids hit around that 3-year mark and they start to become so much more self-sufficient and they're not going to die if you turn your back on them for 2 seconds.
Right.
All of a sudden that normal shifts back a little bit more in your favor, and you get a little bit more of your own time back, and that structure kind of comes back into your schedule and into your day, and you can kind of find some more moments for yourself, which is just so important. And even for me right now, I've got a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old, and they are so self-sufficient that I can actually work out with them in the house, and I do a beach body thing for 30 minutes each night, and it's great. They work out with me sometimes they go and they play by themselves, and I wouldn't have dreamed of doing that just a year ago,
Right.
Some of that, some of your old self starts to creep back in a little bit.
Yep.
A little bit older.
Right. Exactly.
If you could go back to your pre-kid self and say something to yourself, what would it be?
Ooh, that's a good question. I would say the number one thing I would say is don't take on everybody's problems. So I am somebody that I love to play the superhero. I love to play the rock kind of a thing. And I've heard it's like a dad thing. I've also heard it's just like a strong personality thing. I think both are true in different ways. But it got to a point where, I had to get to a point where I went, I can't do this anymore. I'm not able to take care. I wasn't taking care of myself is the way to do it. And it's because I thought like, well, I'm the least important person. I've got, my kids, and I've got, I'm trying to support my wife as well and help her. And it was like right after my son was born, within the first year. And I was, like, I got to help everybody out and I got to do this. And I was not sleeping well. I was not eating well. I was not working out. And I was just like, I was struggling to exist. And I finally was like, I can't do it anymore. And then everybody's like, well, nobody expected you to do it all. And then when I spoke up, way too late, but when I spoke up and got, everybody in my community to like, help out and, build me back up, and I was able to do it on my own, then I realized, oh, this is like the airplane analogy where you've got to put your oxygen mask on first before you can help others. If you don't, you're going to run out of oxygen and pass out. And that's what was happening to me, metaphorically. And so if I had to go back, I would tell, my pre-kid self or brand new kid self, don't try to be the superhero. Put on your oxygen mask first and make sure you're being taken care of so you are in the best position to help everybody else.
And to ask for help.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, gosh, such a big mistake that I think all parents make. And we do think that we can do it all, A, or B, that the only way it can get done is if it's done by us. And that is such a rookie mistake, and one I still make all the time. And I think that I can push myself and do one more thing or add one more thing to the schedule, when in reality I could just ask for help and it would make everybody's lives easier. And my guilt always comes from, I think I'm putting the other person out when I'm asking for help. And I don't know why I can't just get it into my head that they'll just tell me no if they can't do it. It's not a big deal.
Yep.
I've started to get a little bit better with that. I'm asking friends to take my kids or pick them up from things where, it would be a stretch for me to get there from work, or it would, just mess the schedule up. And I've been better at asking for help with some things. So I'm trying to get better.
Right. Right.
What do you wish there was less of in parenting culture? Your podcast talks about a variety of topics, and with all the different types of guests that you've had on, and as many episodes as you have had, I'm curious to know what you would eliminate from parenting culture today if you could.
I wish there was, I guess, instead of less of, I wish there was less screaming, and I'll explain on what I mean by that. What I mean is, I wish there was more of a concerted effort by parents to understand how they are using things like social media and how they're passing that down to their children now. And I think they're not fully cognizant of the way in which they're representing themselves or their opinions or their perspective online, because this is so new and foreign of a concept that they are literally, they meaning, myself, you, everybody, the collective they, are learning as we're growing. And some people are learning better than others and some people aren't. But we are already passing down that information to our children, whether or not we realize it. And I wish there was a more concerted effort to reach across the aisle, whether that's politically, metaphorically, whatever, and just look past whatever, you know, thing that makes you hot blooded that someone posts or says, and just really get to find the person underneath. Because you find, and this is something that I really focus on, is the kind of the thesis statement for my podcast now, is that we have more in common than we don't. And when we're able to sit down at a table and break bread with each other and just get to know the person that's sitting across from you, you start realizing that they're a person who thinks and feels and loves and grieves in all of the same ways we do. And it doesn't matter what it is that you were frustrated about, because they're still a person, and whether or not we agree with them doesn't matter. What matters is if we're able to still be human enough to work together to create a better society. And I don't think you're seeing that a lot nowadays, because people are so conditioned to be silent. I was having this conversation with somebody the other day where used to, you had to work to find that commonality, because if you wanted to talk to somebody in New York or California or Arizona, you had to go physically drive there, and most people cannot do that. So you had to make do with the people around you. And now you don't have to do that. You can be siloed off if you want to, and it's easy to find a group of people that agree with you on whatever it is it may be. And it's conditioned people to not work through that initial disagreement, but instead to buff up against that and then say, well, screw you, dude, and just, go on about their way. And it's teaching our children that you don't have to actually get to know people or work together to create a better world. It's teaching them that you can be selective about who you talk to and just get more and more vitriolic in your responses. And that I'm not here for that.
So when you talk about passing down our social content, do you mean you're not necessarily talking about the pictures we're posting of our kids? You're talking about
No.
content, the conversations, somebody's dumbass comment about Trump. That's what you're talking
Right.
about. And then
Yes, that is correct.
how does that reflect on you? And what is your kid learning from that in the future? Is that what you're talking about?
That is 100% what I'm talking about. So you have people, and I've got lots of friends that are on both sides of the political spectrum, and I see both sides posting very, very clickbaity material, right? Whether Trump's doing this, or Obama was doing that, or whatever the case may be. And it's instead of just having a conversation in person about maybe what policies you agree or disagree on, and just kind of like talking through, like, well, we know this problem is broke. We know healthcare is broken. You and I may have different ways on how to solve it, but let's talk through that to find like where there's some common ground. They're just saying like, Obamacare is good or Obamacare is bad. And it's like, well, there's a lot more nuance, or the Affordable Care Act, I should say. There's a lot more nuance to it than just this is right or this is wrong, but we're not taking the time to see what that is. We're just yelling yes or no. And it's like the world's not black and white or red and blue. There's a lot of gray area there that we're not taking the time to process. And what I fear is that because we're so yes or no, we're teaching our children that there is no gray area. It's either right or wrong. And I think that is a dangerous game to play, in my opinion.
I think that's interesting. And I have to wonder if it's always been the same conversation and it's always been a divisive one, yes or no, black or white.
Mm-hmm.
But because it's online, it's documented there forever. So I
Sure.
wonder if these conversations were always happening, but they were happening at the barbershop or the coffee shop or the water cooler at work. And
Right.
there's no official record of it. There's nothing
Right.
there's no archive of that conversation that you had. So you could get into a bickering match with somebody at a ball game over politics, but then after the ball game's over, you go your separate ways, never to be heard from again.
Right. Right.
Whereas now, you take that conversation online and that could potentially be there as a record forever. And
Right. Yeah.
that's really interesting. I have to agree that I do wonder if parents have the forethought to understand what's coming in the future when their kids are old enough to search them online and
Yeah.
find out. I have those thoughts about this podcast even, or my
Yeah.
blog, and when my kids, stumble upon this someday, and I of course hope that they're proud of the content that I'm putting out and the conversations that I'm having. And I love the fact that they will get a glimpse into my life as it stands today and what I'm
Right.
talking about and what I'm most interested in and passionate about. But I still always wonder, you never know how they're going to react to something like that. So that's an interesting perspective, because I think more often people talk about the do's and don'ts of posting your kid's picture online. And
Right.
I think this is a much more important conversation to have
Right.
on that.
Yeah.
So I love that you're talking about that. And yeah, I hope people kind of think about that a little bit before they post something.
Right. I had a family member. So I was kind of talking to you earlier about, before we went online, about my friend Nick North, who's a trans man. He's a dad, and he originally birthed 4 of his 5 children, and his story is really unique in that he can touch on motherhood and fatherhood. But I have, being in Texas, I have ties to a lot more conservative family members and friends, as well as a lot of my more progressive family members and friends as well. So it's a nice, like, kind of middle ground that I live in. But to that end, I have people that listen to my podcast, specifically this one family member, who was so touched by Nick's story that they reached out to me. They not only shared it, which was unheard of for them, but they privately reached out and said, I would never have if you had told me who this guy was and what his story was on any other thing, I never would have taken the time of day to listen to it. But because it's you and I trust you and I value your input, I listened to the story. I was directly impacted. And now it's allowed me to realize that the trans community, I've been approaching them all wrong, and I'm going to seriously reconsider, like, how I interact with them and how I talk about them in the future. You've really made a direct impact on me. And that right there is the crux of what I'm trying to do, because now they are going to think about what they're posting or what they're talking about or what they're sharing. Whereas before they were just like, I've never met anybody. I'm going to put this group of people in a box and label them and be afraid of them or think they're wrong or whatever the case may be. And it's so crucial when you are able to directly, like, show your children how you're evolving as a person with your mindset and your views and the way you're speaking. Then they can see that, especially if it's something like this where it's online, you can see the record of it. And then they're able to see, okay, like, people can grow and people can change. And to me, that's a way more impactful message than anything I can shout one way or another.
So let's jump in a little bit about your podcast. This is a
Sure.
great segue into it. You mentioned, as we were chatting before we started talking officially, you really focus on bringing a variety of guests in and understanding their perspectives. So why don't you tell my audience just a little bit more about your podcast and what your goal is?
Sure, absolutely. So the podcast is called Dtalks Podcast. The D stands for dad, so it's Dad Talks. But I play on the word detox, DETOX. And so the thesis of my podcast is it's a parenting podcast where you can come detox from the world around you and get a window into how other people live their lives. And I want people to come detox with Dtalks. And I have parents and non-parents alike on the show now. We've evolved it since last year. And we really look at their individual journeys and life stories through the lens of parenting. How are they raised? How has that impacted the decisions they've made, either to have children, to not have children, how they're approaching their day-to-day life, and how they're trying to use whatever they're doing to make a positive impact on the world around them. And it's so interesting to me to when you really dive down deep, and it's almost a little bit like a pseudo therapy session, and you dive down deep into these people's lives, you really start having them see the trail of one decision led to another decision, which led to another decision, and they start realizing how their parents impacted them. And it's really allowed me a lot of reflective moments where I've gone, you know, re-examine my own personal life growing up, and then also examine like how am I approaching my kids. One of the conversations I had on the last episode with the Gibbons is where I talked about, one of the guitar players, Brandon, he talked about how he moved out at 16 because he wanted to pursue music full time and his parents didn't want him to, and he was so mad at them. And I pointed out the fact, I said, well, I think your parents were parenting for the future as opposed to parenting in the now. And I said, we as parents can get so caught up in what little decision that our children are doing. Can we think about the 10, 20, 30 years down the line instead of just addressing it in the here and now? Because it's just, they took a crayon out of a kid's hand. They're not robbing a bank, right? We don't need to always overreact, but it's so easy to. And when you start thinking about it and you hearing these stories and you point that out, they start learning more about their lives. We start learning more about our lives. And in turn, I hope it helps impact the way in which we raise our children. So that was kind of a long, little rambly way, but I got there. It started out as parenting advice, the show did, and then it pivoted to dad journeys, but now we're looking at everybody's journeys through the lens of parenting. I think it's a much more fascinating conversation to have overall.
I love it. I think your guests are fascinating, so everyone needs to go and check it out. Where can they find you online besides searching for Dtalks on their favorite player?
Sure. So so everything is on dtalkspodcast.com. So DTALKS podcast.com, on all the socials at Dtalks Podcast. And then you can always, if you want to reach out to me personally, you can email dtalkspodcast@gmail.com.
Perfect. And I want to wrap up with just one more question, because
Sure.
you started off this conversation telling me that in maybe a more unique way than most dads, that you kind of been dreaming about being a dad, and you had names picked out when you were in high school, which I think is just so lovely. So now that you've actually gotten into the nitty gritty of parenting, what has surprised you about this journey? Is there something that's been surprising about how you actually parent versus what you were dreaming of before having kids, or what's been a little bit of a surprise?
I think the biggest surprise for me has been how quickly I was able to abandon anything I wanted for my future and wholly focus on my children's future. And that surprised me because I always knew that was a part of it. Like, just I innately understood like the concept, but there's something so different between thinking about it and having your firstborn in your arms and looking down into their eyes and going like, I don't care what happens to me. I want you to have the best life in the entire world. And just the ability at which I am making all of my decisions through the lens of how is this helping or hurting my children's lives was crazy. Like, I can't even think about how I made decisions pre-children, because it's like I abandoned that entire thought process the moment my daughter was born. And that really surprised me, but it's been a really pleasant change, because it's, everybody always says it, it's such a cliche, but you don't know what it's like to be a parent until you're a parent. And it's just this switch that gets flipped in your mind, and I wouldn't change it for the world.
A big thank you to Joe Shaw for coming on the show. I've linked up his podcast in the show notes at thisisparentingpodcast.com, but be sure to search Dtalks Podcast on your favorite player.